for this month's session of the JFK Peace Speech webinar, which will be featuring Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, whom I'll introduce after we see the speech. And so, as is our custom, we'll watch the speech, we'll have remarks from Colonel Wilkerson, and then we'll have him in dialogue with the audience. So, Amar, you want to go ahead and start the speech?
Who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter-weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication. One step in this direction is the proposed arrangement for a direct line between Moscow and Washington to avoid on each side the dangerous delays, misunderstandings, and misreadings of others' actions which might occur at a time of crisis. We have also been talking in Geneva about our first step measures of arms controls, designed to limit the intensity of the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace which would take the place of arms. The pursuit of disarmament has been an effort of this government since the 1920s. It has been urgently sought by the past three administrations. And however dim the prospects are today, we intend to continue this effort, to continue it in order that all countries, including our own, can better grasp what the problems and the possibilities of disarmament are. The only major area of these negotiations where the end is in sight, yet where a fresh start is badly needed, is in a treaty to outlaw nuclear tests. The conclusion of such a treaty, so near and yet so far, would check the spiraling arms race in one of its most dangerous areas. It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. It would increase our security. it would decrease the prospects of war. Surely this goal is sufficiently important to require our steady pursuit, yielding neither to the temptation to give up the whole effort, nor the temptation to give up our insistence on vital and responsible safeguards. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce two important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. Second, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad. We must show it in the dedication of our own lives, as many of you who are graduating today will have an opportunity to do by serving without pay in the Peace Corps abroad or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. But wherever we are, we must all, in our daily lives, live up to the age-old faith that peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities today, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. It is the responsibility of the executive branch at all levels of government, local, state, and national, to provide and protect that freedom for all of our citizens by all means within our authority. It is the responsibility of the legislative branch at all levels, wherever the authority is not now adequate, to make it adequate. And it is the responsibility of all citizens in all sections of this country to respect the rights of others and respect the law of the land. All this is not unrelated to world peace. When a man's way please the Lord, the Scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interests of both. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Again, thank you all for attending tonight. I want to welcome Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Colonel Wilkerson was a 31-year veteran of the Army who during his time served as Special Assistant to Colin Powell, both as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and when he was Secretary of State. Colonel Wilkerson for 17 years was the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Government and Public Policy at College of William and Mary, and he is currently a fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network and a member of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We're very pleased to have him with us tonight, and I want to turn it over to Colonel Wilkerson. Welcome.
Thank you. That's a moving speech. Please, audience, excuse me. I've got a really bad cold. It's a very moving speech. I've heard it several times. I'm moved by it every time I hear it. I want to thank you, Dr. Schatz and the Community Church of Boston, a historic venue to be sure, for inviting me back a second time, even if it is only artificially, virtually, via Zoom. And I want to thank the gathered audience for their attention and say that I wish I could be in Boston. It's a great city, and I'd love to be there again. I want to take a few moments and just parse the speech a bit, because it's so important given what's happening today. I'm sure many of your questions, and I welcome them, will be about what's happening today. After all, given that speech, most of what Kennedy asked for, most of what he called for, most of what he very eloquently described is dead. When Kennedy gave his historic speech in that summer of '63, slightly more than 5 months before he was brutally assassinated by by a cabal of government and former government officials, the entire world stood still for a nanosecond. Now, I know as a somewhat learned man that while what I just declared might make for a poetic metaphor, it is geologically, physically impossible after all, but the metaphor makes my point dramatically despite its lack of scientific basis. I suspect that counting out certain ascetics and certain religious or otherwise in the clouds people, as we used to say in the Army, prophets or devil, no one in the 5,000 years of human history that we know something about who was in such an august position of state or tribal leadership, and certainly not the head of a so-called modern nuclear superpower, indeed the superpower, the United States, had ever uttered such a statement. You heard him call with clarion precision for world disarmament and world peace. To demonstrate the uniqueness and the danger of such a call from a sitting president of the United States of America, it's sufficient to note that, as I indicated, he was murdered 5 months later, which is about the approximate planning time and rehearsal time required for such a momentous and successful assassination. Admittedly, certain of those planners, so utterly dissatisfied with President Kennedy for not electing to use the military option in October 1962 and invade the island of Cuba, risking nuclear holocaust, might have initiated their part of the planning much earlier. But the bulk of the team, as it were, took longer to assemble and were ultimately persuaded to go all the way, I think, by Kennedy's remarks that summer of '63, remarks we just listened to. That, too, to me, is very clear. That the nation has not officially recorded these events as having transcribed, as I've just described, makes a little difference. Those who've done the research, I think, know it's true. Why were his remarks, and here we come to the meat of the matter, so explosive, so volatile, so existentially threatening to the oligarchical, warmongering corporatocracy that since World War II has increasingly come to be and now is the real power in America? Well, first, Kennedy declared, you heard him from the presidential pulpit, that the most important topic on earth was world peace. That's a direct quote. Imagine the shockwaves sent out through the airways to men such as Paul Nitze, Allen Dulles, General Curtis LeMay, even such stellar lights as Dwight Eisenhower, who abominated Allen Dulles, by the way, and Harry Truman, who, when Kennedy was later murdered, wrote one of the few, almost immediate, accusatory op-eds, December, I think it was, a couple of months after the assassination, directing his ire straight at the Central Intelligence Agency, which, however, reluctantly he had created. Now, there was one other individual that came out with an even more immediate response. And if you want to read it, it's eloquent. It's quite long, it's quite detailed, it's quite precise, but it's eloquent. And it was rendered by Fidel Castro, then the president of Cuba. I believe it's safe to say that at that time that he spoke at American University, no one in the security complex, lots of applause from the audience, but no one from the security complex of the great superpower was not shocked to the marrow of his or her bones. But there is more to come, and it's worth quoting in full again as the president described what he meant by peace. What kind of peace do I mean, he rhetorically asked. Not a Pax Americana, not something forced by America, not something enforced on the world by our weapons of war. Think about what we're doing today with our weapons of war and others by proxy with our weapons of war, Ukraine and Gaza and Israel on Gaza in particular. He talked about not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. He was talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Think about Gaza. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, including the Soviets. Not merely peace in our time, but a peace for all times. These sterling words were anathema to the complex that had come to run America, that owned our Congress lock, stock, and barrel, that dictated the nation's foreign and security policies, that indeed dictates in the present sense our very life today. What more did he say? He trod into the sacred ground of visceral hatred, of sinful propaganda, of unheard of all vitriol toward the Soviet devil. Well, think of Ukraine today and Vladimir Putin, the Soviet devil's replacement. But what did Kennedy say then? He said, among the many traits the people of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual reports of war. I think that's true. Almost unique among the major world powers, we've never been at war with each other. No nation in the history, and this is why the Soviets abhor war, no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the Second World War. Compare those remarks of Kennedy to the absolute silence of our current president in that very regard at the recent D-Day ceremonies in France. The Soviets lost 20 million people. The Soviets drove the Wehrmacht, the finest operational army in the world at the time, from their defeat at Stalingrad all the way to Berlin, losing millions of people in the process. But they beat the Germans. Overlord and our invasion of Normandy, I'm sorry to say, was an afterthought. It helped, yes, but the people who beat the Germans and the reason they got to Berlin before we did were the Soviets. Kennedy went on, at least 20 million lost their lives, as I just said. Countless millions of homes and farms were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the devastation of this country from Chicago to the east. Think about that for a moment. These were startling admissions of the truth, but there was more, even more devastating to the Cold War warriors to whom the president, I think, addressed them. He spoke of world disarmament and world peace, and of getting well started by banning nuclear tests of a treaty regime to outlaw such tests. What have we done today? We have abrogated every single treaty with regard to nuclear weapons that we had in the world, to include the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which banned an entire class of nuclear weapons, the most dangerous weapons in the whole inventory. He announced that the forthcoming talks to get that treaty would be in Moscow, not in Geneva or London or Washington, Moscow. Likewise, he announced that America would lead the way by ceasing such tests immediately. All of this was heresy to the warmongers proliferating in our government. When the president went on to say categorically that the world knew that the United States would never start a war, that's a direct quote, could he know that the future America would not only mock his words, but start multiple wars simultaneously and use proxies to start others? Recall that I said first the president talked of peace, and indeed he did, in terms no American president had ever used. But second, and again in startling rhetoric, he spoke of these most dangerous weapons ever invented, the ones affected by his test ban treaty, nuclear weapons, certainly the greatest and indeed final threat to peace in all of human history. Now, this speech of Kennedy's, this courageous outpouring of what I believe was a small kernel in his mind, even as he labored to save the lives of the crew of his PT boat, PT-109, old people like me remember that, in the waters of the Pacific after a Japanese destroyer had rammed it on the night and morning of 1 and 2 August in 1943. From that time on, this speech was in his mind, I think, or this concept was in his mind, as I would like to think it's in every soldier's mind, and I use soldier to describe all service members. This speech was spectacularly out of sync with the ideas of the U.S. security establishment, not the people wearing uniforms, not the people shedding their blood. Just as was Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence out of sync with the majority of Americans, who were, yes, a small majority, but a majority, were either British sympathizers or what we called at the time Tories. That is to say, they thought George III was the rightful ruler. And they thought that men like Jefferson were insane at best and rank traitors to King George at worst, which is what make the final words of the Declaration of Independence so powerful that we celebrate, I hope, today. In fact, in my view, the most powerful words in the document, but I didn't come to that view on my own. I was led to that view by Colin Powell, a true admirer of Jefferson and of Jefferson's writings and his infrequent speeches as president. A black man. Powell once pointed out this reality to me in his mind, and it came that way to me afterward in rather dramatic fashion. He simply asked me one day what stood out most poignantly in the Declaration of Independence. And as I recall, I said the words encapsulating the right of a free people to set aside or even overthrow their existing government should they find it interfering with their rights as a free people. He said, okay, well, that was not the case with him, though certainly those were important words. The thrilling words to him were these: and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That was a soldier speaking. Powell went on to explain that each of these individuals had every reason, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, every one of them had every reason, indeed the weight of evidence was heavy in this regard, to believe that at the end of the day they would find themselves swinging from the yardarm of a British man of war in Boston Harbor. After all, they were taking on the greatest empire in the world, and they really had nothing but their words. Powell then pointed out to me the most important part, the stated progression of assets they pledged to one another. Their lives, the least important, their fortunes, more important because that meant their families, and finally, their sacred honor, the most important thing of all. Because without honor, there was no reason to exist. Imagine if one asserted such a concept today when there is so little honor that it is accurate to say the concept is dead. But JFK would have agreed with Powell and I believe would have said that his honor demanded that after he had experienced the Berlin crisis, actually more serious than Cuba, and then the Cuban crisis, each of which took the world to the brink of nuclear war. In other words, when he had seen into the pits of hell and human extermination, he was honor bound to do something about it. And so he did, starting that day at American University. And the modern day Tories of America saw to it that he did in fact swing from the yardarm of their man of war in Dallas in November in 1963. We should, all of us, get down on bended knee and pray to whatever providence we hold dear, or to the great mother in the sky if need be, or whatever we call greater than ourselves, for another such man or woman in the Oval Office who will pledge his or her life, fortune, and sacred honor to such a goal. There is so much at stake here. Not only the liberal democratic republic our forefathers started here just shy of 2.5 centuries ago on this day, but the world is at stake. Because unlike all the empires of the past 3,000 years, in fact, unique among all empires of all earthly time of which we are even remotely aware, none had developed the technological skills to obliterate themselves and their planet. Indeed, except for religious zealots and their believers, only some sort of divine being was attributed with such a capacity for wholesale destruction of human existence. But we alone among thousands of human civilizations, we developed the apparatus to completely wipe out the world. Moreover, we built and built and built the tools of that apparatus until the total number of warheads approached 60,000 in 1989. Sheer insanity. In 1991, as the Cold War came to a rather abrupt end, we set out with great determination to eliminate as many warheads as possible in that almost mystical interlude in our insanity. And we made great progress. We eliminated more than 40,000 warheads, but then the insanity overwhelmed us once again. And now, here we are. And now the nuclear weapon states are 9. And not only building weapons again, we and they are making even more dangerous ones. And we have canceled all of the treaty regimes we established in the Cold War. We, the United States of America, have canceled them. There's nothing remotely restraining us now. Likewise, we're engaging in proxy wars such as Ukraine. Remember what Kennedy said? We must never do this, where one of the belligerents is a nuclear weapons power. Nay, 2 of the belligerents, must I say 3 or 4, counting France and London? We all have nuclear weapons, and Russia is looking increasingly at us as being in the war. Putin just established what we think is a no-fly zone over the Black Sea, a highly escalatory move, if it's true. Frankly, there seems no limit today to our insanity. A few years ago, I came across this statement from a renowned American scientist. First, he stated what I have stated, that, quote, we are the first civilization in human history to develop the means of our own wholesale destruction. That is a technological marvel of the first order, but it is accompanied by a telling question. Do we have the wisdom to control it? Unquote. Let me say that again. Do we have the wisdom to control it? To me, that is the most important question of this 4th of July. It is crucial that we get to work answering it in the affirmative, especially if we care about our children and our grandchildren celebrating such a singular holiday in the future as we do now. You could rightfully claim it is the challenge of not our particular age, but the challenge of all ages for all time. We must pay a decent respect to the opinions of all of humanity. John Fitzgerald Kennedy knew that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. We're going to have exchange between the audience and Colonel Wilkerson. And I'm going to ask people to raise their hand in using the icon so we can call on you. And because there are a number of people that probably will want to ask questions or have statements, I would just ask for people to be brief as they can, so it allows others to also participate. So let's turn to the first hand is Miles. And Amar, can you, okay, Amar, can you unmute that, Miles?
You should be able to unmute.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, go ahead, Miles.
It's an honor to be speaking with you, Colonel Wilkerson. I'm in Canada, Treaty 7 territory, also known as Alberta, Canada. It's a good thing you're there and I'm here because you have a cold and I'm just 20 days after a stem cell transplant to rebuild my immune system. And, you know, it's a testimony that even though we were at war with each other in 1812, today, researchers in stem cell transplants from Calgary, where I am, and Toronto, interchange with specialists in Seattle and cross-pollinate regularly, sharing the wisdom. But here's my question, Colonel Wilkerson, regarding the act that created the CIA in 1947 to 1948, from the book JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters. Quote from the book: before the act was passed, Secretary of State George Marshall warned President Truman that it granted the new intelligence agency in particular powers that were almost unlimited, a criticism of the CIA that Truman, as you mentioned in your presentation, would echo much too late, soon after the assassination of John Kennedy. Marty Schatz often makes the point that it is time for concerned citizens to realize we have all the evidence we need to condemn those institutions that are protagonists for the unspeakable, basically the bad attitude or the void of compassion, an attitude that the masses seem to be unaware of or have been lulled into passivity. There's no shortage of evidence of the bad attitude that promotes regime change and endless war to conquer all territories and markets, like the games of risk and monopoly, as Professor Jeffrey Sachs has described our culture to be. Your thoughts, please, on the CIA, the unspeakable, and any visionary ideas on how we might mobilize concerned citizens right now without further delay to operationalize compassion. Thank you.
Well, those are excellent comments, and it's an excellent question. I just had an opportunity this morning to explain to a friend of mine who's been out of government for some time, when he tried to tell me how the chain of command works with regard to direct action, which is the most brutal and corrupt and, in my view, illegal thing the agency does. And I had to clue him in. Most Americans have no idea, for example, how the operation in Abbottabad, Pakistan, to take out bin Laden was conducted. It is standard operating procedure today, and it became that way right after 9/11. The CIA uses the military. They don't do direct action anymore, because if they do, they have to, by constitutional prerogative and direction, report to their oversight committees, the SIPC, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the House Select Committee on Intelligence. So how do they get away with that? They go to SEAL Team 6 or some other very sophisticated special operating force in the military, and they give them the orders to do it, with the National Security Council's permission, of course. And that means maybe the president, maybe the National Security Advisor, maybe the Deputy National Security Advisor, maybe a senior director on the NSC. Think Oliver North and John Poindexter in Iran-Contra. And then they carry it out. So not only is it as bad as Harry ever envisioned it being, today it is brutally stupid, insane, and so out of sync with what most Americans would say they stand for that it's cruel. Now the second part of your question is what to do. Get rid of it. I think Jack Kennedy was maybe apocryphally, I doubt it, quoted saying it, the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, which the CIA used to burn him, the CIA ought to be broken up into 100,000 pieces and scattered to the winds, or some statement to that effect. I agree with him 100%. Should have been done a long time ago and would be a lot harder to do today because they have so much power. They built up power in the Congress. They built up power in the bureaucracy elsewhere. And they built up power the same way J. Edgar Hoover built up power. They have a file on everyone. I wonder who killed Epstein in prison, Mossad or CIA. My money would be on CIA. So I don't have an answer for how you get rid of it, except by having the American people elect some people to the Congress who would take umbrage at what the CIA is doing now. And by the way, in my experience with talking to members of Congress, there are none of them that know what I just told you. I doubt that there's 1% of Americans who know how the military and the CIA are lashed up today to keep both of them from oversight in the constitutionally approved process. They are linked at the hip, not the entire military, the Special Operations Command and the especially SEAL Team 6 and the other very sophisticated special operating forces. These people are killing people in your name and my name, and often without anyone knowing anything about it except maybe 3 or 4 people on the National Security Council, maybe not even the president, particularly if the president, like Dwight Eisenhower did a couple of times with Allen Dulles, says, don't tell me, don't tell me, meaning just get it done, but don't tell me. Your question is relevant, but I don't know what to do about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sharon, do you want to, yeah, go ahead. Wait, you go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have a few questions, but I'll just ask one of them. How can we hold war criminals accountable in this country? People that have committed crimes against our country and crimes against humanity. There is no accountability. How can we change that?
We just had a discussion, we being Eisenhower Media Network and some others associated with us, like some fellows from Quincy, the Institute for Responsible Statecraft, about that very issue. First of all, it was all of our conclusions. There was no dissent on this, that there is no accountability in America anymore. Well, and we were talking high level stuff. We were talking about general after general after general in Afghanistan failing, no accountability. Should have been fired, should have found another general. If you don't want a state bill, general, and I'm telling you to state bill, I'll find a general who does. No, they were brought home and made chiefs of service or went to Lockheed Martin for a $500,000 a year job or whatever. There is no accountability. The reason there is no accountability is what I referred to earlier, but I'll give it some more specifics now. We have no Congress worth a damn. There is no committee in the Congress with the knowledge, let alone the moral and political courage to take these people on and achieve some kind of accountability. We had a state-sponsored torture program in the administration I served. Now, let me say that again. You know, we tortured in the Philippines, we tortured in Vietnam, but we didn't have a president approve in the Oval Office with advisors present a torture program until George W. Bush. That's a first in American history. No accountability whatsoever. If you've seen the movie, The Report, that was glossed over. Dianne Feinstein was not the big hero she looked like to be. She knew everything that was going on, but only when it became politically opportunistic to do so, she started that investigation. And then she got herself and her staffer into a mess by doing that. They didn't have the guts. Here's the most truthful scene in that movie. When that young staffer who's done all this to reveal this torture program, the rendition, detention, interrogation program, RDI program by the CIA. He's done all this work to reveal it. He goes to jail. He's visited in jail by a CIA operative who tells him, We have all the lawyers in the world and deep, deep, deep pockets. Now, you can either shut up and walk out of here, or you can stay in here for the rest of your life. I mean, that's the power of these people. There's no accountability, none. The guy who burned the tapes, you see him in jail anywhere? He burned the torture tapes, proof positive that we had these secret prisons and we were doing brutal things to other human beings. Proof positive because the CIA had the gall to videotape the interrogations. And then he burned it. He got rid of it. And Gina Haspel later becomes director of the CIA and she was his boss. There's no accountability.
Okay. Next we have Jim Carpenter. Just hold on one second. You go ahead.
Colonel Wilkinson, thank you all for listening to us and presenting to us. I belong to a group, Progressive Democrats of America, and in this group there's a committee, End the Wars Committee, and we're looking at the movement that Joe Biden stepped aside because of his mental issues. We're looking at that movement as an opportunity to have a candidate for president who would be like a Kennedy, who would move us towards peace and not continue the policies of President Biden. Can you talk about the movement, the Step Aside Joe movement, as an opportunity to find a different type of candidate that will promote world peace rather than continue the failed policies of Joe Biden? And by the way, I put in the chat, rootsaction.org. You can go there and sign the petition that Joe Biden step aside and we find a candidate who will promote world peace rather than constant war. Can you talk about that campaign?
Thank you for the question. Who's the candidate?
Well, we don't know who the candidate will be is right now. I mean, that's up for the Democratic Party to find some process to determine that candidate at their convention. But what we're hoping for is that with enough pressure from the grassroots and from people like you and the people you know, that they won't just replace Joe Biden with somebody with the same foreign policy, but actually find a candidate who has a different foreign policy. Because in places like Wisconsin, where I live, there are a number of people who will not vote for Joe Biden because of what's going on in Gaza. And so he may lose in these swing states like Wisconsin. So we want a candidate that will have a different foreign policy and which will again allow me to vote Democratic. But we don't know who the candidate will be.
Well, I'm with you. I just don't know who the candidate's going to be, and I couldn't be with you, wholeheartedly until I see who the candidate is. I do agree with you, though, and I applaud you for starting this movement, that it is a vital moment that we have to change the whole tapestry of essentially 340 million Americans, of whom maybe 170 million or so are above 35, male and female, and we can only find Joe Biden and Donald Trump. That is appalling. It's almost as appalling as the previous question about accountability. We can't achieve accountability. We can't find a better candidate to be president of the United States. I'm all for what you're trying to do. The time is very short, however, to do it. And finding someone and getting them in position where they could actually give Trump a challenge and perhaps win is going to be a daunting task. Unless it's someone that we aren't thinking of who might draw enormous poll ratings right off the bat, because let's face it, it's a race to the TV. It's a race to the visuals. It's a race to, I hate to say this, but Americans just don't respond to people like John Kennedy speaking truth in whole English sentences with complex semicolons and periods and such. So finding the person is the real challenge there. I applaud what you're doing, but I'd want to see the person and I'd want to see the program for electing that person before I'd throw a lot of weight behind it.
But is it worth attempting even before we find a person? Because the person will be found probably in the convention, out of a brokered convention, and hopefully they'll find a better person. But, you can't put the cart before the horse here. We have to
No,
first.
I hope you're right, but the Democrats have a very different way of doing it than the Republicans. The Republicans just go in the room and decide on somebody and walk out. The Democrats have to have a convention and they have to discuss it. And I'm afraid that in those discussions, what we heard Kennedy talking about and what I tried to emphasize in my remarks would hold a lot of power and a lot of weight. And we just wind up getting someone who's just a replacement for Joe Biden, rather than getting someone who's different and going to do the things that perhaps you and I would want them to do. That's my worry, is that the system is broken. The system that puts people up for election, the system that keeps them in office, the system that grants them. Look at Clinton and look at Obama. You're billionaires when you leave the White House now. Thomas Jefferson was a pauper when he left the White House. He was a pauper when he went in. So it's a different world now, and I don't know how you conquer that particular aspect of it in order to find someone. I know why Colin Powell didn't run. We talked about it endlessly, really, because I wanted him to run, and not because I wanted to work for the president of the United States, but because I thought he was a good man, ultimately a good man who had the best interests of America at his heart. I'd seen him for 16 years. He wouldn't run. And he wouldn't run. Oh, they say it's because of his wife. They say it's because of her depression. It's this, it's that. He wouldn't run because he looked at me and he said, I don't have the fire in my belly because I don't like that world. And that's what most good people will say. They don't want anything to do with it. I've even had good people tell me they don't want anything to do with the Senate or the House of Representatives. People are walking out of the Congress today after one term, because they say if you talk to them, they will tell you it was so disgusting, I couldn't stay there. Well, how do you ever get the place changed if you can't convince good, honest, decent people to come in and serve a term or two and then go home again? And while they're there, do good things for the American people. I don't know what I'm saying, except we may be at the end of our rope.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Maybe you'll nominate Lawrence Wilkerson. I don't know. It's the best thing I've heard in a while.
Fantastic.
Too
Okay,
old.
let's let's see. Next up is Gerald Belsky. We have to unmute you. Just hold on. Go ahead, Gerald.
Okay, great. Actually, I think Colonel Wilkerson would make a great candidate. But I represent the Schiller Institute and the International Peace Coalition, which is pulling together a coalition of leading people to speak out before the presidential election now, because we see ourselves heading into a nuclear showdown, very similar to what President Kennedy confronted. But we don't have anybody in the White House now who's prepared to negotiate. So our coalition that we initiated is calling on sane forces like Colonel Wilkerson, like Marty Schatz and others within the institutions of the government, people who have either served in the government or have been prominent figures who are speaking, basically reason now to basically do outside of the White House what President Kennedy did, and to call now for negotiations, because everything that President Kennedy called for, the current war faction, what you identified, Colonel Wilkerson, as the oligarchical forces, they are denying and escalating to war. And therefore, the real threat of a nuclear showdown is right there if we continue doing what we're doing. So therefore, it's critical that voices like yours are heard. And we have put out a petition, which I put on the chat, I can put it on again, basically saying declare independence from imminent nuclear war, begin negotiations now. We want to rally sane forces in the United States. We know there are forces around the world which are echoing the intent of President Kennedy. If you look at the BRICS, the movement for a new economic order, the call for a new security order, the Russian offer for a new security architecture, there's tremendous openness now for negotiations. And I think the best thing we could do is get a call for immediate negotiations to stop this escalation of nuclear war. So I would invite people to look at the petition, circulate it. The International Peace Coalition will have a Zoom meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Anybody is welcome to join, and you can send me your info on in the chat. I'll be glad to email you in a Zoom link. But I wanted to ask you this, Colonel Wilkerson. In Kennedy's speech, he referred to Soviet propaganda at the time, saying that they believe that there are forces in the West that would like a preemptive war and would also want to enslave Europe. And I think today there are such forces. I don't think it's simply propaganda. I don't think everybody, but there are forces, if push comes to shove, would prefer that to sitting down and negotiate. So the question is, how do we rally people for immediate negotiations against this threat of nuclear war? Because I don't believe most Americans want a nuclear showdown. And I think if they saw leadership, it's not coming from the White House or from the candidates, it's got to come from somewhere else.
Well, there's two angles on this that really trouble me right now. And the group I was with yesterday, we had military professionals, we had a conversation about this. One is that we know the condition of America's armed forces right now. And despite the fact that they've been getting close to $1 trillion every year for almost a decade, that money has gone principally to two things. Half of it has gone to contractors, and another half of it has gone to pay the enormously expensive all-volunteer force to stay in existence. That's everything from $100,000 bonuses to you name it for keeping people in, and they still can't recruit enough. So, for example, I'll just give you a couple. Eisenhower just pulled out, the carrier Eisenhower just pulled out of the Red Sea after 9 months. Those boys and girls hadn't been home to Norfolk in 9 months. That's a hell of a long deployment. There's no ship to replace her. And if there were, we're not sure it could sail because we don't have enough crew to complement her. We are so short people in the reserve components that we could not mobilize if we tried. We'd have to go to a full draft overnight. Imagine what that would do to the country. We all agreed in this group that half of the people of draftable age between 18 and 24, say, would be across the Mexican or the Canadian border within 48 hours. I mean, that was a dramatic statement by one of the general officers present, but he's probably close to being correct. Bringing it on that way and also drafting women. So that's the first answer. Our armed forces are really in sad shape. Now, the second answer is I think the administration is backing that fact up, because I refuse to think that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, or even Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is lying blatantly to the President of the United States. And even if the President is incapacitated and can't understand what they tell him, then certainly Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and others can. So that leads me to the conclusion that they're depending on nuclear weapons, that ultimately they think they can bluff their way through the Ukraine conflict, bluff their way through the Middle East conflict, bluff their way through anything else, like, for example, Taiwan and the South China Sea, because we have nuclear weapons, which means to me that they don't understand nuclear theory, escalatory theory, if you will. Thinking you can bluff your way through with a miserably incompetent lower-level conventional military with the backdrop of nuclear weapons is to invite a nuclear exchange. I mean, all the theorists during the Cold War pointed that out. It's one reason why Kennedy said what he said about you never want to have two nuclear powers at war with each other, and we really are in Ukraine. And if Putin's declaration of a no-fly zone over the Black Sea includes shooting down U.S. warplanes that are providing intelligence to Ukraine, we are truly at war. And what are we backing that up with? Nuclear weapons. I think Putin has come to begin to understand that to a certain degree because he's got good intelligence too. And so he's being awfully careful about his escalations, which really troubles me about this one. I hope it's not inclusive of shooting down manned aircraft. maybe shooting down drones and other unmanned aircraft. But I hope it doesn't include shooting down manned aircraft, because Biden is going to take that, I think, as an act of war. And we're going to be at war with another nuclear power, a verboten thing. And then the third part of the answer is there are some real threats in the world to what I would call U.S. vital national security interests. They don't in any way, fashion, or form gravitate towards the way or the people or the states that are expressed as those threats. But there are some real threats. One of them is the climate crisis. And we're not dealing with it in any real way except on the surface, particularly with regard to emissions. We are going to reach 2 degrees very shortly. And 2 degrees is going to be a hard world to live in. 3 degrees is going to be almost impossible, and 4 will die. We're headed that way by mid-century. So we've got these colossal threats that we're confronting, not to even mention the fact we've destroyed all the nuclear weapons treaties and need to get back to them. And yet we're being focused on these threats that are down in front of us that are really about U.S. hegemony. That's what Ukraine is about. U.S. hegemony. We feel like our hegemony over Europe and over 740 million, 500 million, if you subtract the Russians, is being threatened. We felt like Germany was growing too strong as an economic power. We felt like, why else would you take out Nord Stream pipeline? We did that. We did that, and we knew what it would do to Germany's economy. We did it intentionally, not just to break Germany away from the Russians and their energy profile, but to actually hurt Germany's economy, which we have done. Look at the elections that are happening now there. Germany will be the next one to fold. France has already folded. Germany will be the next one to fold. Look at the only sane voice in Europe right now. The only sane voice in Europe, if we count Russia out of Europe, which I don't do, a map puts them in Europe, but let's put Putin over there in Moscow. The only sane voice in Europe is Orban. Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban sounds today like Winston Churchill did in 38 and 39 with respect to Germany. Viktor Orban is telling us we are creating a nightmare in the heart of Europe. He's the only one telling the truth. The Secretary General of NATO is not. The new one is probably going to be worse than him, I'm told. We have new members of NATO. The alliance is so unwieldy now, it could fall apart at any moment. Its southern flank, anchored by the largest and most effective land army in NATO, Turkey's, is about to leave, I think. Erdogan just waiting to give his middle finger to the European Union, which has been giving its middle finger to him for 20 years about joining the EU. These are desperate times, and we are making up for the desperation with our nuclear shield. That's my calculation, and that's a very dangerous thing to be doing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We have a question from Sri Lanka. Faisal, do you want to, we'll unmute. Just hold on a second.
Yeah, I know.
There we
Thank-
go. There we go.
Thank you, Colonel Wilkerson, for a very entertaining and very informative speech. And I've been watching you for a long time, and I thank you so much for coming and joining us today. But President Kennedy talked about strengthening the United Nations. But my question to you really is, do you think the United Nations is irredeemably captured by the oligarchs of the great powers, and also the undemocratic nature of the Security Council and the use of the veto? Can the UN be actually reformed, or have you got to tear it to pieces and start again?
That's an excellent question, and I think the immediate and direct answer is yes, but you got to get rid of the United States first. The UN is a creature of Washington. No matter what we say, no matter who's the Secretary General, it's a creature of Washington. To a lesser extent, it's a creature of the other PERM 5 members, PERM 4, if you will. But more than anybody, it's a creature of Washington. I watched it. I couldn't believe some of the things I saw. When Helen Clark had all the promise in the world to be a first at the UN, she was going to be a Secretary General who would pop the whip. She'd already cleaned up her part of the United Nations. She'd fired incompetent people. She'd fired people who were corrupt. She put good people in place. She demonstrated she was a first-class leader and a first-class manager. What did we do when she was nominated to be Secretary General? We said, oh, no, no, we can't have her in there. I was there because she might act against us from time to time. And so she didn't make it. We got our guy in there. At times, he will speak in ways that are contravening of what we want to do, or he'll accuse us of this or that, particularly over Gaza, and I applaud him for that. But basically, he's our guy. So you got to get rid of the United States. Now, that's impossible. So what you do is you revise the UN Security Council. You revamp it completely. You take the 15, let's say, and you say, okay, we'll keep up the same election process. We'll keep the permanent 5, 6, 7. You ought to throw some more people in there because there are other countries that ought to be a part of it. India comes to mind immediately. Maybe Sri Lanka wouldn't like that, but India comes to mind immediately. Brazil comes to mind. So maybe you have a permanent 8 or a permanent 9, and it takes 3 vetoes to kill an action. I'd buy that. And the 15 grows to 20. Or let's revise and revamp the UN and make it possibly more effective and less subject to the idiosyncrasies and influence of Washington. That's the first thing I would do. I don't think the UN is passé. I think we'd have a hard time without it, but we'd have a lot better time with it if it were revamped and revised along the lines I've just described.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Derek. Hold on a second. We'll get you unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Colonel, for your presentation today. It's been amazing. I think the elephant in the room is capitalism. Bernie Sanders has a new book out. It's okay to be angry about capitalism. He says it's an immoral system and it has, and we don't need billionaires. And he doesn't call for socialism or communism or any other ism. He calls for a bunch of policies that take care of the American people and have us understand that war is profitable. The reason we don't have peace is because there's no money in peace. And as long as we have a capitalist system where profit is the organizing principle of this nation, we're going to have war. And we don't have any discussion about capitalism and whether or not it ought to be the system that runs us. And we have 800 bases in, I don't know, 70 countries or 80 countries. It used to be 125 countries. Nuclear weapons are now illegal under international law, but it doesn't affect us because we're not in the International Criminal Court. Why are we not in the International Criminal Court? Because if we were, we would be brought to task for war crimes. We all know that, so that's why we stay out of the International Criminal Court. And then, as you mentioned, climate change is over the hill, coming over the hill, and fossil fuel companies are killing 60,000 Americans every year due to premature death from air pollution, and 6 to 7 million people throughout the world. Your comments, sir?
Well, that's quite a tapestry to comment on. I don't disagree hardly with anything you've said. I'm a big fan of Thomas Piketty. I've read both of his tomes, about that thick. I'm pretty sure Bernie has too. But Piketty's right. Capitalism has seen its day, and there's got to be a better system. And I don't mean communism or people confuse communism and social. Communism is a political system, and socialism is an economic system, if you will. Let me tell you why I think it's going to have a moment where it is absolutely essential that it change. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, just released its latest report, which Bloomberg and a guy by the name of John Malden reviewed. John Malden is a very competent economics writer. He thinks the CBO is overly optimistic, but let me tell you what the CBO said. You know probably that this year we're going to have $1 trillion interest payment on our debt. $1 trillion. That's more than the defense budget. Well, by 2034, says the CBO, 2030 or 2031, says the John Malden and Bloomberg, and that's not very far away. We're going to have a $50.7 trillion aggregate debt, and the interest payments annually are going to be Medicare, Medicaid, the defense budget, and Social Security combined. That is unsustainable, utterly unsustainable. I don't care if you run the printing presses forever. And that's one reason why people think that Ukraine or some other provocation, the South China Sea or whatever, is why Putin and Xi and others like Lula in Brazil are talking about replacing the dollar. I'll tell you why they're talking about it, because they know it's so corrupt it's going to collapse. And they know we're going to collapse with it. And Europe is somewhat worried about that now too, because they see us retrenching and going home, which they're probably right. But what I'm worried about, if I'm still alive, I may get to see this if I live another 10 years. We're going to fall apart. We are going to fall apart. We're going to become 50 little Bhutistans. We're going to become 50 little countries. Texas is going to be independent, California. We're going to fall apart because you cannot sustain this kind of debt. And the moment you fail to make that $1 trillion or $2 or $6 or $8 trillion interest payment on the debt, you've defaulted. China is now paying for each little increment in the Base Road Initiative by selling our bonds and taking the profits and paying for it. We are financing China's future. That's how crazy what we're doing in the world is today. All to say, there is a reckoning coming. And I think Malden's right. If you go back and look at the Great Depression, or you look at what was really a worse depression than the Great Depression at the end of the 19th century, it's just that we weren't quite in the position we were in 1932 and 33. We had replaced Britain in the world as the leading economic power. Brits didn't know it until they got out of Suez in 56, but we were the new empire in the world economically. And what's going to happen, according to John, and I agree with him because Piketty talks about this too, is the American people, the moment they wake up on Monday morning or Tuesday morning and say, my confidence is gone, it's over, it's done. And you look at the New York Times the other day, there was a little article in there, and I read every word of it. It reported on how people were going into CVS's and they were walking back out again. And the interviewer was at the door and he held a mic up and he interviewed them. And they said, I'm not going in there to shop. Have you seen the prices? And that's a loss of confidence. That's a small example, but it's going to spread. And I'm telling you, we're going to have hell to pay. $50.7 trillion of aggregate debt. There's never been such debt in the history of human beings. And by the way, private debt and corporate debt is roughly in the same shape. One of the things the report talked about, and this is a mystery to me, unless someone's cheating, and of course they are, the FDIC is $75 billion in the hole. How do you go in the hole if you're financed by the premiums banks pay to you for the insurance? How do you go in the hole? Well, I'll tell you how you go in the hole. Somebody stole the money. And I'll tell you who stole the money too. Your Congress. We're in trouble. Capitalism will go when we go.
Thank you. We have just a couple more minutes. There was a question, an interesting question in the chat, comparing Putin with Khrushchev. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about that, because people say, well, Putin's not like Khrushchev, so Kennedy's speech is not really relevant. But I wonder if Putin might be more like Khrushchev than people imagine. And I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think I would be more inclined to your point of view. There is a difference. Khrushchev was bathed in the death of Stalingrad. And you can't be bathed in that kind of death and that kind of destruction and that kind of existential threat to everything that you stand for. I don't care how hardened a communist you might be, and not be affected by it. Maybe Joe Stalin could, but even Joe Stalin got scared to death when all of his plans went to heck when Hitler turned on him after the Ribbentrop-Stalin Pact, and all of a sudden you had the Wehrmacht running towards Moscow. So Khrushchev had a searing experience that probably gave him, well, the same kind of, if you've ever read a blow-by-blow of Kennedy's PT-109 and what he, I don't know how true the sources are, but everybody paints these things differently. And unless you were there, it's hard to tell the truth. But I mean, I see Kennedy swimming with a leather strap in his mouth, with a half stroke dragging a wounded man in the ocean in the Pacific on August 1st, 2nd, 1943. This is a guy who also, at a different level, knew what war was all about. On the other hand, Putin has been in a war of his own. It might not have been a bloody and a bleeding war, as it were, but he was in a war. He was in the Cold War. He was at the front lines in the Cold War. He was in one of the most dangerous places in the world, the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. And so he's been seared by that too. And I've listened to Putin at some length, especially when he breaks into English, because he's very proficient in English when he wants to be. And I've listened to good translators, I think, of what he's saying otherwise. And Putin could not be more clarion right now in his call for sitting down and talking. The antagonists he's speaking to are deaf and dumb. And I was really saddened to see the performance of Joe Biden at the debate, because I'm beginning to think that might be part of it. I don't give Blinken or Sullivan much credit for independent thought and action. So if the president is somewhat inhibited in his ability to think clearly and constantly and consistently, then we're in deeper trouble than I thought. There's no one advising the team in America, diplomatic, military, or otherwise, of how to deal with Putin. They're just refusing to deal with Putin. And that's a mandate, apparently, from the president himself. The only person who can talk, and he has to clear it with the president, is Austin. And it's only when there's something that looks like it might turn into something bigger that Austin gets to call Moscow, or Moscow gets to call Austin, and he'll take the call. This is not the way. This is not the way to do business in the world. But that's the way we're doing it. And it's a sad thing, but we really need this election badly, and we need someone to replace Joe Biden and to replace this whole team. And I'm not advocating for Donald Trump. If you've read Project 2025 and you have listened to the man who is the head of the Heritage Foundation, who put that together, you understand what I'm talking about. And this guy reminds me of Reinhard Heydrich, about whom Hitler said, he's got an iron heart. And some Czech and Slovak special operators murdered him, assassinated him in 1943. This is the guy who was the head of the final solution meeting for Hitler. That's who this guy reminds me of, this guy who put out Project 2025. So I am definitely not advocating for Donald Trump. But we do need someone. We need someone who's competent.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who came. We will be doing a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this event, and you'll get a copy of the discussion as well as the speech. I wanted to let people know that we have a program scheduled for August 10th with Professor Glenn Deason from the University of Southeastern Norway. And his talk is titled Ideology and the War Against Russia. So he'll be discussing that. But again, thank you, Colonel Wilkerson, very, very much. And thanks everyone who participated, and hope to see you soon.
Could I drop one more pearl on the place?
Please.
This is a pearl, I think. I came across this. I didn't even know this existed. It's a plaque somewhere in New England. I got a picture of the plaque, but I could not find the state nor the specific location. The 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Remember what I said about hanging from a yardarm in Boston Harbor? 9 died of wounds from the war. 5 were captured and imprisoned. 6 of their wives and their children were killed, jailed, or badly mistreated, or left penniless. 12 signers' homes were burned to the ground, and 17 lost everything they owned. They truly were the first patriots.
Again, thank you very, very much. And good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.